Jason, you kind of cue us up when you're ready for us to go.
Yeah, actually, we just started streaming, so as soon as you guys are ready, you can go ahead and start.
Okay, so we're recording now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, so welcome to everybody. Hello, my name is Clay Dubberl. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Mississippi, and we are very pleased today to have our first in a series of webinars, tentatively called right now, Speak with the Scholar. And so today we're very welcome and pleased to have Saras Sarasvathy. I did mispronounce it, Sarah, so I apologize on that. Saras really needs no introduction, but I do want to highlight some of the many amazing things that she's done. She's an associate professor, an Isidore Horwin research professor at Darden at UVA, University of Virginia. She's obviously published exceedingly well. Some notables include Academy of Management Review, Strategic Management Journal, ETP, and Journal of Business Venturing, just to name a few. Along those lines, she has also won numerous awards, including the 2001 William H. Newman Award from the Academy of Management and the 2009 Gerald E. Hills Best Paper Award from AMA, American Marketing Association. In addition, she also serves on editorial boards of Academy of Management Journal, Journal of Business Venturing, and Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal. And last but not least, she was also in 2007 named the top 18 entrepreneurship professors by Fortune Small Business Magazine for entrepreneurship. And if you have not done it yet, I highly recommend you go check out her website, www.effectuation.org. So with that said, the long introduction, Saras, let's get started. Can you kind of tell us a little bit more about effectuation and how that's affected entrepreneurship literature and research?
I would actually think that somebody else has to say how it has affected. I can tell you how it's affected me. It's taken over my life. It's one of those things that, I tell my doctoral students this. It's not abnormal at the end of your PhD program to come to the conclusion, one thing, and that is you don't want to work on this thing anymore. Right? I am one of those fortunate people. I'm still working on stuff from my dissertation for the most part. I was very, very fortunate to be able to get access to this data from the expert entrepreneurs. It is amazing to me that after all these years and all this work that has happened, mostly from a variety of researchers other than me and my collaborators, it surprises me. People still think that somehow the Academy of Management Review paper is something I dreamed up and published in AMR. In actual fact, that AMR paper, the theory actually comes from data from the expert entrepreneurs, so it's actually induced theory. And it just turns out, because I was fortunate to get access to this amazing data of the Think Aloud protocols of very, very, very experienced entrepreneurs, I was able to come upon a theory that actually seems to work in the world in some important ways, right? But the other piece of it is also that it seems to link with major ideas from the history of ideas. And so I think that's what makes the whole thing powerful. I'm just fortunate to have my name associated with it, and I'm along for the ride for the most part. But the theory itself comes from the expert entrepreneurs and connects in really interesting ways with big ideas like the philosophy of pragmatism, or ideas that are connected with the roots of entrepreneurship theory, like Frank Knight's theory about Knightian uncertainty, right? So because the theory comes from a good source and also connects with major ideas, I think the impact is probably going to outlast my life for certain. And given what other people have done with the theory and are continuing to do, I am just amazed to see where this could be headed. So what the expert entrepreneurs have learned through experience seems to have profound connections with major ideas from history. That's really it. And if to the extent that that is true, I think this could continue to be a source of theory development in entrepreneurship. I'm pretty bullish on that.
Excellent. Could you take us a little bit, because you mentioned how it came from your data and then talking to these expert entrepreneurs. Can you kind of describe the moment when you had your aha or light bulb moment where it all came together?
Yeah, it's actually kind of Hollywood or Bollywood, however you say. So, okay, I've never told this story I think in this way before, but I'll tell you the story. So I was, at Carnegie Mellon University. I got to work with Herbert Simon as the advisor for my dissertation, and so I said I'll go for the brass ring, and I tried to think what would the brass ring look like, and what I really wanted to do was, if you have been an entrepreneur for years and years and years, 15 years or longer, and you've started multiple ventures, including successes and failures, what are some things that you have learned that I can learn and teach in a classroom? This was the way I was thinking about it. So even though my dissertation might give you a more formal research question and stuff like that, in my head I was thinking, I know a lot of things can't be learned in the classroom. But the idea was there really is more to be learned in the classroom than just the toolbox of, say, cash flow management or business planning or anything like that. So that's the piece I wanted to go after. And I just used a method that had been used a lot in cognitive science in studying expertise, which is the think aloud verbal protocol. And the method is, it's very simple and powerful. All it does is that if you're an expert in something, I give you a task or a problem set in your field of expertise, and then I make you talk continuously as you solve those problems. So the idea behind that is that when you're thinking and talking, you cannot make up a good story. And if the problems are designed in detail enough, then I can get a look inside your head and look at not just what you're doing or your reasons for why you're doing it, but I actually get to see how you do it. Like, how do you go from what information do you look at, what information do you ignore, how do you go from point A to B to C? So as you can imagine, this is pages, thousands of pages of transcriptions of protocols from these expert entrepreneurs. And the beauty of it is, all of them had built companies in many, many different industries, but they were all looking at exactly the same problem set of the same 10 typical decisions that all startups go through. So that's how you get something that is comparable across industries and ventures and so on. So I have these thousands and thousands of pages, but most of them I'm also getting on planes, going to these people and conducting the experiments in their offices. And every time I'm also listening to the tapes all the time. So Herb taught me, always work with raw data if you can, before you transform it and start running analysis. And so I spent hours and hours listening to this. And my very last protocol was from the founder of Medtronic. By all logic, I should have gone and met him in Minnesota. But when I called him to set up the appointment, he said, unfortunately, I am no longer operating out of Minnesota. You have to come to Hawaii to meet me. And I thought, oh my God, I'm so disappointed, So I went to Hawaii, I got to hang out with him, and then I kind of added a couple of extra days. I had gone all the way to Hawaii, and it was the last protocol, and I said, I'll take a couple of days, and then I would still listen, still anxious, still not quite clear what I'm hearing and finding in the data. I'm sure all researchers who have done any inductive theory know the feeling. And then, but I knew enough that every time I would collect the data, come back, talk to Herb, we were finding things like expert entrepreneurs hate market research. And I still remember Herb looking at me and telling me, that is interesting, expert entrepreneurs hate market research. But that's not a dissertation, right? You have to tell me, what do you mean by market research? What do you mean by hate? And why do they hate it? And if they hate it, what are they doing? So we were having all these things. So we knew these nuggets, right? They hate market research, or they don't particularly believe in discounted cash flows as a way of making financial decisions. So we knew what they did not like. But when I went for these long walks, it just struck me that what they really hate is prediction. Right? That they just, every time there's predictive information. So this word prediction came into my head, and then I knew where I needed to go to develop theory, right? Because I had read Frank Knight earlier on, and I knew Frank Knight's distinction of 3 kinds of uncertainty. And I said, okay, now I know where to go. I went back and reread Frank Knight, and that's where the aha moment came. So the aha moment came, by just living with the data for a long time, like Jane Dutton says, right? You just get these little pearls, these nuggets. And I've been collecting these nuggets. They hate this, and they don't like this, and they will never look at this information. That I knew from the data. But what made them all connect, the word prediction, that they're all predictive information, that came during one of my walks in Hawaii. How much more romantic can this get, huh? And then it struck me, so I couldn't wait to get on a plane again and come and read Frank Knight, because I didn't have it online. We didn't have Kindle then. I had to come and actually take the book out of the library and read it, and then I read it, and I'm like, I felt disconnected to Frank Knight. I cannot tell you. So this is my kind of Hollywood, Bollywood story of the aha moment.
That's a brilliant story, by the way. That is fantastic.
And then, of course, it took, I don't know, 18 months to
Yes.
turn that into something that you could, that you write and people actually want to read.
That's a great point. You had your aha moment, and then once again, then you had to go demonstrate why it was.
Yeah, and also really just work out, really think about what's the connection here, right? And link everything in the findings to the framework, to actually develop a framework from the findings.
Okay,
that's not easy. Yeah.
No. And I don't know if now's the right time, but I do want to ask this question. This is a quick aside. Could you talk a little bit about your work habits? Because I think that's something that's a little misnomer. Because I think once you've made it, that you don't do anything anymore. You just kind of hang out and do cool things like this interview. But tell us about your work habits and.
Yeah, I'm afraid that if I do a few too many of these things sometimes, I have moments of angst. I have been an entrepreneur before I came into academia, so I have a head for details. I don't know, years of just actually doing things, you also get work habits that are, and I've never been overly, these moments of inspiration are important and they are memorable, but the real work is all in actually working, right? Coming back and reading the book and working on so I'm very good about systematic work. I tell people, and this was something I had also got from UPS, that you write every day. So I don't just write papers or book. What I do is I have a way of trying to write every single day. I always have like a front burner writing project that is work, right, that you write, but I also just write. And a lot of the work writing that I'm actually working on a paper or a book chapter or whatever it is, I can go to the bits and pieces that I've been writing since, every day I can go to that for inspiration. I go to that for sometimes just to get started, or if I'm stuck, I go there. But the writing itself, I'm kind of systematic. Unless I have like a full day of travel or a full day of teaching, most days I do not sleep until I have written a bit. So I have that. And the other thing I love, and I tell my doctoral students this, that if you want to succeed in research, of all the things, it's not even about being smart or reading a lot. We are always ignorant. In fact, I think the more number of years we are in this business, we get more ignorant. It's very weird. But the thing really that helps you is not to have like a diva attitude to it, and most importantly, to enjoy rewriting. So, getting to the first draft is messy and it's a bit of agony, and that it's not that systematic. But once you have the first draft, rewriting and reading. So I have no problem. Most papers are like version 35 and more by the time they are even submitted to a journal. And I love that. I actually kind of enjoy rewriting. If you hate rewriting, I think we are in the wrong business. I'm sure you'll agree with me. Like, how much rewriting do you do? And then, it goes through 3 rounds of review, gets rejected, and then you have to rewrite it all over again for another journal. So if you hate that, you're going to hate it's going to be very stressful to do what we do, right?
I think I know, and you know this better than I do, working with doctorate students, that there's definitely that feel, that accomplishment that, we got a draft done, let's submit it, let's send it out.
And also that there is this magic paper theory. This paper is perfect, And I tell them there's no such thing as a perfect theory, paper. Most manuscripts eventually get accepted because, somebody got tired and said, okay, this is good enough, let's accept it now. It's never because, this is a great paper, we want to accept it, we need to accept. No, I think that never happens.
That's excellent. Switching up a little bit and then taking some of the questions that we got from Academy members, division members earlier. Specifically, I don't know if you have the list with you so you can read, because this is a question from...
I printed it out, I have.
Okay, excellent. A question from John Kerr at Wilfrid Laurier University. And he has a really in-depth question that I wanted to I think it's a really good idea because it kind of gets everything percolating and describing the nuances of effectuation more. So in the question, and I apologize to the audience in terms of reading it out loud because you're at a disadvantage. John goes on to say, in Aaron Saraguchi and Berkemper's 2015 critique of effectuation theory, they convey that a key defining characteristic of the effectual problem space is a penurious resource environment in line with bricolage. They quote you when you suggest that effectuation may be appropriate for an entrepreneur faced with resource limitations. While I agree with your statement, I find the Aaron et al. Interpretation problematic, and I have 3 related questions in this regards. And first, the means test of whom one knows speaks to social capital, for example, Napiet and Ghoshal and Edler and Kwan. How broadly or narrowly do you envision the answer to this being interpreted? I.e., what definition of social capital do you rely upon?
Okay. I love John's question because it allows me to give you an answer that's a little bit larger than the question, even though the question itself is pretty deep and large to begin with. But I want to mention this because this is also the struggle with effectuation theory for anybody who is working on it, either empirically or to elaborate it further theoretically. And the essence of the problem here is that effectuation is a theory about sufficient conditions, none of which are actually necessary. So stop and think about this for a moment. And most of us, most of the time, think in terms of necessary conditions that may or may not turn out to be sufficient for performance, right? So a lot of our theories are things like the role of resources or the role of traits or the role of motivation. What are some necessary traits or necessary motivations or necessary resources or skill base for performance, right? We are always thinking about theories that way. But effectuation, this is why it's kind of important. Expert entrepreneurs have learned that don't chase necessary conditions that may or may not turn out to be sufficient, because then you just have probabilities and you're placing a bet. The way to tackle night in uncertainty is not to place a bet, right? So don't chase necessary conditions. What you're looking for are sufficient conditions, each of which may be completely unnecessary. Now let me explain that. So now we think about, the success of a restaurant, say. We think about that because, of course, people need to eat, so there is a necessary condition, so there's a market for food, and then we say, people like hot food, or people like, tasty, unhealthy food, or people need the healthy food, and all those things. But what effectuation suggests is really that there are many, many, many ways to solve the problem that people need food, right? And each solution is successful because in some way it is sufficient, but not necessary. I mean, you can imagine a world without McDonald's. You can imagine a world without Whole Foods. I mean, people are not going to starve because McDonald's doesn't exist or Whole Foods doesn't exist. But each of them has provided a sufficient solution for a market. So what happens with this is when you take something like resources that Arendt et al. Talking about, effectuation works better in a penurious environment. So it becomes saying that a penurious environment is a necessary condition for effectuation, right? And actually, absolutely not. And I stated that in some depth in the book, but I actually discussed necessary and sufficient conditions. What effectuation says is basically that any condition is actually sufficient, and none of it is necessary. So having money is not necessary. So of course, in the penurious conditions, you can use effectuation. But having money is not something that comes in the way of effectuation either. All it means is your affordable loss levels are higher. And the example we give for affordable loss is Richard Branson going to Boeing and telling Boeing, let me have a plane. I'm sure you have a plane, just parked in some hangar somewhere doing nothing for you. Let me have that for a year. Now, for Richard Branson's, it's kind of affordable loss to ask Boeing. But for Boeing, it's kind of affordable loss to give him the plane as well, right? So in one case, you can think about it as penurious, an entrepreneur who doesn't have the resources to buy a plane. But you also think about, because affordable loss is something that happens over and over again, not just with entrepreneurs, but with stakeholders.
Right.
Which brings me to John's question directly, the role of social capital. Right? So this is something very strange, and it's connected with another question that you have here, which is a challenge for entrepreneurship researchers. It connects with that as well. So one of our challenges is that entrepreneurship research is being done in so many different fields. Right? So from amongst my own papers, the paper that addresses this very well, and I think that paper is as important as the AMR paper, is one that I co-authored with Nick Dew, and it came out in the Journal of Evolutionary Economics, where we actually talk about effectuation as not this theory about individuals, right? Day one, maybe you are an individual entrepreneur. But almost the first thing you do is you start interacting with other people and start bringing stakeholders on board before you even have a prototype. And we go through that in considerable detail in that paper of how that happens. So the social capital question, I have the same answer as the resources question, which is really that you can have any and all social capital or none, and you can still do effectuation. So, so what I mean by that is you can be a poor, illiterate woman in Bangladesh, and maybe you only know 4 people, and most of them women around you, and you can still build a venture, right? So the only requirement in effectuation is that you actually build something, that you actually act to build. That's the only actual assumption about human behavior. Or human resources or traits or social capital. That is absolutely so. You can take any definition of social capital and talk about effectuation, because effectuation is not about what capital you have, but what you do with that capital and how you do it. And most importantly, how you do it with other people. And so I think when you think about it that way, effectuation is a theory about sufficient conditions. So using the necessary condition lens always kind of misleads you in assessing the theory. And I want to make one more point, because this is such an important point. And this speaks to what Herbert Simon used to speak about with economic theories all the time. He said that in economics and in philosophy, they have this notion of Occam's razor, right? So you want a very simple theory. You want the simplest theory possible. But what happens when you use the Occam's razor on theory, what happens is your assumptions become, horrendous. So when you have all the subjective expected utility assumptions in economics are where all the complexity hides. And the theories become very simple, and they become very aesthetically pleasing and seductive for the most part. And Herbert Simon argued in a paper where he said Occam's razor has 2 blades, right? And he suggested that bounded rationality does the opposite, that it really has virtually no assumptions. But the theory itself is messy and more complicated. And effectuation is that kind of theory. It makes absolutely no assumptions, except the fact that the entrepreneur is a human being. We could imagine effectuation in ants, and I gave that example in the book as well. But for the most part, we assume it's a human being, and we assume a certain amount, a very, very tiny bias for action, that you will actually act on something. Yeah. And those are all the assumptions you need to think about effectuation. The rest of it is all about what you do, how you do, when and where you do, and with whom you do it. So it's kind of a peculiar theory that also, I believe, is going to give its longevity, precisely because it's not a normal theory that has all kinds of assumptions about human behavior or is searching for necessary conditions. neither of which is actually a part of effectual thinking.
Excellent.
Long answer, but it was also a very important and deep question.
Yeah, no, a brilliant answer, especially when you think about it in terms of the social capital aspect, but also from both sides, the stakeholder side, the social capital, but also I like how you stress the need for action.
Yes.
And that's what differentiates it quite a bit.
Yes.
Very good. And real quickly, if you're watching this live, sorry, quick brief announcement here, Saras. If you're watching this live, feel free to tweet us at ENT_webinar_AOM. If you have any questions for Saras, please feel free to do that. Once again, that tweet is at ENT_webinar_AOM. And moving on to the second part of John's question. So in an entrepreneur's cognitive assessment of possible courses of action, are they limited by, one, the means that are immediately available, or two, the means that she anticipates may be available through her social connections?
Excellent question. And this one speaks to the principle at the heart of effectuation, which is really non-predictive control. Mm-hmm. So when you think about means that are immediately available, so long as you think about means that are within the control of the entrepreneur and her stakeholders, then it is effectual. To the extent that you think you will have some means, or you're predicting somebody will give you something, or some means will become available in the future, that is actually, it would go into the predictive category, and therefore, theoretically speaking, not effectual. You see what I'm saying? Empirically, of course, these things get mixed up, right? Because think about this. Who am I is one of the source of means in effectuation. And who am I could include different levels of beliefs in prediction. So there is a certain amount of empirical murkiness that will come. But theoretically, we want to keep this separate. And the way to separate it is is to kind of cast it in terms of prediction versus control. So when you say readily available means, if you mean these means are within your control in actual fact, right, then that would be kind of effectual approach to the means-driven principle, right, the bird in hand principle. But to the extent that you are predicting that you will have the means, or you are visualizing some way to get the means, it becomes prediction and therefore not effectual. Theoretically, if you want to keep it clean and separate, that's the way to think about the role of means.
Okay, excellent. That's a great answer, by the way, on that. It's a great answer, because I don't know if we should throw this in now, because I know you always get the question, what's the difference between, improvisation and bricolage and everything else right there. Yes. So, excellent. So the third part here, can you confirm that the affordable loss principle should not be interpreted as implying a penurious resource scenario, although it could, i.e., is it hard to imagine that the expert entrepreneurs in your original sample or others who would meet your definition of experts, such as Bill Gates, actually face such constraints?
I think I preempted this question already, right? But giving you the Richard Branson example, there is no necessary condition in terms of what your resource circumstances are in effectuations. It is, all it says is that if you're Richard Branson versus if you're Boeing, your affordable loss levels are different. That's all. But it has absolutely no assumptions that the resource conditions have to be penurious or should not be. There are no assumptions about resource conditions. There are actually no assumptions about social capital either, as I mentioned. There are no assumptions here, except the idea that if you are a human being, you're probably born with some idea about who you are, and there are things you know, even if all you know may be how to tend to a tomato plant. And there are people you know, unless you're raised by wolves. We haven't done any studies on wolves, but for the most part, there's probably a couple of people you know, and that's all it assumes. But it doesn't mean that if you know 1 million people and you're Bill Gates' son, that you cannot do effectuation. There's no such assumption there.
Excellent. No, actually, I was just thinking Romulus and Remus, which also go into your effectuation theory with the wolves. They're very nice. So this is moving on. Thank you, John, for those questions. It was great. This is building upon, you've alluded to this already in terms of the longevity and legacy of effectuation theory and entrepreneurship. Where do you see effectuation theory in terms of some of the trends? Because I know you have lots of conversations with people who are always excited about effectuation theory anytime you go out, most likely. But where do you see this going in the future?
It would be ironic if I answered that question.
Yeah.
The whole idea of the theory is not to try to predict the future.
Especially your theory.
I'm not going to attempt that. I'm not going to attempt to predict the future, but I can share with you some things that people are doing that have kind of surprised me because I would never have predicted that. So I know of a couple of people who are trying to apply effectuation to life, right? An effectual life. What would an effectual life look like? I know educators who are thinking about effectual teaching. This is not about teaching effectuation, but teaching effectually. And these are educators from a wide variety of disciplines: architecture and art history and physics and everything. There is a nonprofit organization that has developed an effectual protocol for negotiating peace agreements between warring tribes. They did some of that in Sri Lanka. It didn't work very well. Then the Nepalese came to them and they said they wanted to try the protocol, and they refined it, and now they are using it in Africa and the Middle East. And so the idea was really to apply effectuation to peace negotiation. I mean, these are things that I could not have predicted. I had nothing to do with it. There are people have sent me papers to review from political science, where there are talks about the process of introducing new laws, how effectuation works there, things like that. So there are really surprising things happening. So that I do not want to predict. I do know that within the entrepreneurship division, within people that at least I have met and interacted with, there is a lot of excitement about understanding how this might work in a large organization. And there is a lot of interest in thinking through how to teach effectuation and research on entrepreneurship education, K through 12 education. There's also interest in developing links with social entrepreneurship. These are more phenomenon-based, but also theory-based. There is work that is connecting this with the size distribution of firms in the economy, for example. There is work connecting this with some macroeconomic theories. So I know that the idea is being used in unusual ways. So I don't really want to predict, but I would love to hear from people who are trying to use it in different ways. I was recently in China, and there were people who were interested in thinking this through to think about what is the connection between a centralized, non-democratic government and how effectuation happens within that system. There are also lovely work that is beginning to be done, I think, between effectuation and social capital, something that John has read, but also kind of the how do you get a new network started or take your network and grow it into a large effectual network. There again, the connection with China is interesting because of the Chinese cultural concept of guanxi. So I know that there is really interesting work done. I myself am working with groups of researchers on trying to understand really early stage stakeholder relationships. So I don't know whether I answered this question, but I'm not good at answering this kind of question. I'm just glad people are doing stuff with it.
So I was going to say, so it sounds like it's really become mainstream and much more than just say in the entrepreneurship or the management literature. It's gone beyond those borders or domains.
Yes, that is funny because Dean Shepard said at one of the, I think the last not the last one, the one before that effectuation conference in Lyon, Dean was there and he said, effectuation has moved from being a cult into a church. No, I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but something like that. I think it's not, I don't think it's considered just a weird thing that, that someone out there does. I think there are, as I said, if an idea is going to last, it has to connect with other big ideas. And I think that's what people are trying to do. And to the extent that we do it, that will be the future,
That's brilliant. So actually, we got someone who tweeted.
Okay.
And so we're going to switch up a little bit here on you, and I don't know about live fire or anything like that, but this is a teaching-related question from Werner Bacher, and she asked, if you were to design, if you were to design a new undergraduate entrepreneurship program, how would your research influence this type of design, and how would it, quote, be differentiated from, say, the more traditional approaches?
Okay. I know that people are trying all kinds of innovative things in the undergraduate program. I know a few years ago, Kaufman had given out this funding for interdisciplinary across-campus entrepreneurship program. I mean, Babson is doing some really interesting things, and I know there are lots of. So when we talk about traditional approaches, I am not quite sure what we are assuming. But if we assume a traditional course to mean something like the standard model, right? You come up with an idea, you go and do some market research, you show there is a market for it, then you do some, calculations and financial projections and write a business plan, and then you pitch it to somebody, and somebody gives you money. In the meanwhile, you put together a team, and once they give you the money, now you can put together a better team, and you execute on the plan. And then in 5 years, you sell, or you go public, or go off to the Bahamas, or whatever. If that is the framework on which people are saying, if I think of that as the basic traditional framework, then of course you do not do that in effectuation, right? So I would rather if people just simply started by doing something where you think about. This is something, again, I want to attribute it to my co-authors, Nick Dew, Stuart Reed, and Robert Wildbank, because when we started writing a textbook, we were thinking about writing the textbook as a standard undergraduate course, right? 15 weeks, and we added a few extra chapters, so we had 20. Class sessions, really. And so we literally designed the book that way. So we were thinking about this. We were thinking about what would be different. I mean, it's one thing to say, yeah, you have the effectuation framework and the 5 principles and all that. But Stuart, who has a lot of practical experience as an entrepreneur, he kind of took the lead on the book. And in our conversation, we came up with this idea because we had also traveled to different parts of the world talking about effectual entrepreneurship. And people will usually say this, right? I want to be an entrepreneur. This is kind of a cool thing now, right? Everywhere you go in the world, people say, I want to be an entrepreneur. And then they'll give you 4 categories of reasons of why they don't do entrepreneurship. And the first one is, I don't have an idea. And by that, what they mean is, I don't have a brilliant idea. I don't have a novel, new to the world idea, right? I don't have money. And sometimes it will take the form of other resources. It will say, I am not a technologist, I don't have time, whatever, but I don't have resources. That's really what they're saying there. And then I'm afraid to fail, right? I don't know what will happen. I don't like the uncertainty. I'm afraid to fail. And the last one is, I don't know what to do, right? And so that's how we organize the book. So we say effectuation is a framework that takes away those 4 reasons, right? So for example, I don't have an idea. In effectuation, you don't have to start with an idea. You definitely don't have to start with a brilliant idea. You just start with who you are, what you know, and whom you know. And you say, what kinds of things can I do? So you can easily imagine organizing an undergraduate course that takes these 4 objections, works their way, and then along the way gives people toolboxes, right? So the second one, I don't have money, naturally feeds into the affordable loss principle. You don't have to have money or time or resources. You can actually say, what can I afford to lose? Can I work nights and weekends? You don't have to leave your job. You don't have to, raid your children's college fund. I mean, there's really and there's example after example. We have 200 case studies we have written so far. So you can see how the effectual principles actually map onto these objections. I'm afraid to fail, right? The lemonade principle and the crazy quilt principle. How do you deal with negative surprises? You turn them into lemonade. And one of the ways you deal with failure is you don't fail alone. You keep them small, you kill them young, and you don't fail alone. So this whole idea of working with self-selected stakeholders, each of whom invests only what they can afford to lose. So keep that small. So when failure happens, the costs of failure are really, really low, and the potential for the next one to succeed becomes higher. And so it addresses all these things naturally. And I don't know what to do. Of course, there's lots and lots of details and effectuation on what to do and how to do it, when, where, etc. And so that's the way I would think about it. And now once you've used this frame to design the course, you can now think, do you want this to be a capstone and have people work on projects? Do you want this to be an introductory course where you can have a series of case histories or case studies of ventures and maybe a couple of entrepreneurs coming in? Do you want to create a series of fun exercises, which we have tried to create for each one of them? And there's a whole bunch of educators who have created, fun exercises that you can do to illustrate some of the principles, but also some of the in the trenches toolbox type stuff, right? So, for example, we have an exercise that really shows you Knightian uncertainty and how it works and why effectual principles would work there. We have an ideas exercise. That is a bird in hand exercise. That's 3 or 4 different bird in hand exercises that people have created on the website, and I rate the website to get some of these ideas too. So the format and the content of the course you can have a lot of variety in it, but the key is really the framework is very different. So you take the traditional objections that people have as to why they cannot do it or their concerns why they cannot do it and make that the framework for the course. So you don't even have to have effectuation as the framework. You actually have practical concerns as the framework, and so that's how I would go about doing that. But I'm sure there are more innovative ways, and people are doing that. I know people are doing more innovative things than I can think of right now.
So following up on that question, Sarah, so I know that you've had a chance to teach a lot of graduate, including MBAs and EMBAs.
Yeah.
How do they respond to the effectual logic and thought process versus, say, maybe undergrads? Is there a difference in the way they approach it?
Yes. It's not the question of the way they approach it. The way they come to it is kind of very interesting. So I teach at Darden, right? At Darden, we have this idea of student-centered learning. So we try not to teach in the normal sense of the word. So we don't tell you, here's what you learn. We actually have to work with the students where they are and get them to some extent on where we want them to go, right? So you have to kind of get their buy-in and they have to come with you. So how they get to it is very interesting. See, with the undergraduates, right, it takes one inspirational story, or it may take just a little reading or effectuation or a video they saw or something, and they are crazy. Now they really want to try this. They want to use the jargon. They want to do all that, but usually they have to be inspired. There has to be this moment of inspiration, and also, kind of get them to see what they are capable of. And that's different for different individuals who are young, right? Because, just cold calling somebody or making this, what I call an effectual ask to someone, when you're not yet ready, you feel intimidated to talk to somebody who is older and successful. So there are these moments you have to overcome them. But if they overcome, they pass the threshold, then they're up and running. It's no stopping them. With MBAs and more seniors, it's a little different. You get what I call a bimodal response, right? There are people who are so very much bought into the causal mindset, and it has worked very well for them. And so they're going to push you back on it. They're just going to push back, saying this doesn't make any sense, because they have something to lose, right? They have to. So getting someone to unlearn something is way, way more difficult. We know this from cognitive science. It's practically impossible. So you have that. And yet you also have people who are, who have been within the causal mindset, and it has worked for them, but they're deeply dissatisfied with it. So there are sometimes, there's this pushback from one group, but there's also pushback this way. They also kind of go at each other a little bit. And to navigate that is interesting. And one of the ways I try to do is, on the one hand, I tell people about the 2 toolboxes, right? So you have this and it works. Think about stress testing it. Tell me, when does this not work? And let's say can we use effectuation there, right? That's kind of the under the radar approach. And the other one is to let people do their own thing, give them assignments, and then you will see the people who are dissatisfied and who truly want to try effectuation when they come back, and then they suddenly see that there is a creativity, there's a kind of a fun, there is joy, there is something happening here, and then so it's kind of this lateral engagement that works as well. But it is tougher. It's tougher to teach people who are committed to certain things, that they've made big decisions in their life with a particular framework, and you're asking them to change their mind is much more difficult. And I'm certainly not, like an expert on here's how you change their mind. I have seen some of my colleagues who are wonderful teachers who kind of walked me through in the early stages. I had colleagues sit in my class and actually work with me on how to do this, and I've learned a thing or two. Did that answer the question?
Very much so, because I do it a lot with MBAs, and actually I just personal testimony. I use a social entrepreneurship project where it allows them to go out and engage in social entrepreneurship and actually run a business for a month. And
that's a great idea.
But building it up, though, we use the effectual logic. And we talk a lot about effectuation and everything you just described. I totally agree with you. And I was just wondering, because I'm thinking at Darden, I'm sure you get some people in there who said, this has always worked for me. I don't want to change. So.
Yes. And also we have 7-week courses. Our course length is 7 weeks. So that makes it a little bit more challenging as well. I think it would be easier to do it over a semester because you have more opportunities for the aha moment to occur for different people. But
I agree with you completely there. So follow-up, we have one more teaching question before we go. Slide back over to some tweets. And once again, thank you for tweeting. If you're doing this, watching this live, we have several for that. In terms of, you can tell this next question is from someone who has to defend teaching entrepreneurship. So can a person who studies entrepreneurship by looking at the cases of existing businesses and understanding business models ever become an entrepreneur herself?
I thought that was such a cool question because I actually get asked the opposite question all the time. And this is the first time somebody's asked me this question. I get the opposite question. Can an entrepreneur who's been in the trenches and build, can they come and teach? And then they ask the opposite, another opposite, I don't know what it is. It's a different kind of opposite, which is, can someone who's never been in the trenches teach entrepreneurship? Right? So you usually get that question. Like, can a practitioner actually teach because they don't, they cannot generalize from their experience? And the other thing is, if you've never been in the trenches, you don't know to play golf, can you be a, golf coach, that kind of thing. But this is a good one, right? If you study this and learn it and try it, can you actually start? And my answer to that would be, of course, right? This is who you are and what you know and whom you know. Now, if you take that, if you've been an entrepreneurship researcher and you've studied these entrepreneurs, and let's say for most of your adult life, this is what you have done, and then you try to start a biotech company, all bets are off that, right? But if you actually say, who am I, what do I know, and whom do I know? Maybe you have a biotech student with 3 PhDs, and they want you on their board to give them effectual advice or entrepreneurship research-based advice. And then if you get in that way, so long I would actually say that if it is linked to who you are, what you know, and whom you know, and you always work with things within your control, I don't see why a teacher shouldn't be a very successful entrepreneur. And one of the iconic cases is Jack Ma, right? Who built Alibaba. He started as an English teacher and started with translation, right? It was translating, and then built one of the most successful tech companies, the global tech companies in the world. And so I don't see why you cannot do it. But so long as you actually use what you know, right, which is all the research you've done in entrepreneurship. And then I honestly believe that you cannot do it alone. So it has to also work with other people. So you start with who you are, but you're going to work with other people. And so if you do it that way, I don't see why you shouldn't succeed. I say go for it, whoever it is. Exactly.
Excellent answer. I was just going to say once again, it's that action. As long as you're willing to act, that's the key right there.
And also interact. You right. If you absolutely hate talking to another human being, then it might be difficult. But
Saras, that's an excellent segue, by the way, to one of our tweets. This one is from Michael Crawford. And he goes, to what extent does effectuation describe human functioning? Is it a theory of human development as well?
Aha. Again, wonderful question. One of my doctoral students who is now in UMKC, he did, his name is Ishrat Ali, he did his dissertation on the Human Development Index, and also basically thinking through our very idea of performance in entrepreneurship, and how that connects with the performance measures that are not in GDP but in Human Development Index. And through his dissertation, you know how with PhD students are the best way for us to learn. I got a little bit of an education in sense work and the development of the Human Development Index and things like that. And sense, I think Michael may be asking about sense conception of functioning, right? Human functioning. And I think the link is beautiful for me because the link is through psychology and social psychology, right? So effectual thinking is a way to educate people into optimism. So a lot of Martin Seligman's work on learned helplessness and then how you transform helplessness into optimism, a lot of that feeds into effectuation. I can easily imagine a course where you presumably or explicitly what you're teaching is effectual entrepreneurship, but what you're really teaching is optimism, right? Is a way of looking at, and when you have optimism, when you are able to take ownership of your own future, right, you begin to function in the sense of functionings that in the sense in which Amartya Sen talks about capabilities and functionings. And so I think entrepreneurship in general, but effectual entrepreneurship definitely can be a mechanism through which you can develop human beings into taking more ownership of their lives. Which brings me back to something that we had talked about earlier, which is the idea of an effectual life. That this is not just a skill to build a venture, but it's a skill to build a future, right? Whether it's your own future, the future of your family, community, or the world. So I think these principles are useful. And after all, they come from the experience of entrepreneurs who have built living, enduring, highly value-creating ventures in the world. So it comes, and they learned this the hard way through the school of hard knocks. So why wouldn't it be useful in developing the human being?
So I think maybe we got
that to a person, it transfers into optimism, I think.
Okay, excellent, Sarah. So you cut out just briefly right there, but we'll just your answer is right on the money. And by the way, I just want to highlight once again the point about optimism and the power of entrepreneurship to change people's lives through that way. So excellent. Another tweet from Suzanne Santos before we move on to some career questions to wrap us up today. Susanna asked, how does effectuation theory explain business opportunity recognition?
I'm not sure effectuation theory explains anything much. I think effectuation theory is a method, right? It tells you how to do stuff. It refers in some descriptive studies to how people have done stuff. So to think about how it explains recognition, I am not very sure. Because again, when you talk about explanation, what we mean is a bunch of independent variables and a dependent variable, right? So here are some things that are necessary conditions. And to the extent that they are there, you will have, so you observe a whole bunch of x1, x2, x3 variables, and then you explain why, right? Opportunity recognition. So that's the way you would think about it. Effectuation says that there are many, many, many sufficient ways in which you could recognize opportunities, right? One could be simply that you have a connection. It's like the classic economics idea that you see $100 note lying on the sidewalk, right? It's as simple as that's the quintessential simple case of opportunity recognition. But the fact is, if you think about it a little bit deeply, there is a lot more to it than that, right? So imagine that $100 bill not being a bill at all, or a dollar bill in the normal sense of the word. Maybe it's Indonesian rupiah, and you have no idea what it is. You don't know whether it's actually counterfeit or not. So it already assumes a lot of things, right? It assumes a bunch of institutions that allow you to recognize a piece of paper as a currency first, and then to know that the currency has value, and to know what to do with it, right? So there's a whole bunch of things, all of kind of human institutions and history that are embedded in it, and that's where the effectuation thing says that's all right, right? So it is okay if you do not recognize the opportunity as well, because maybe you never saw a rupiah in your life, and maybe you didn't recognize it as currency. You just thought it was a colored piece of paper, and you walked by, and that's okay. So effectuation doesn't explain opportunity recognition in any way, but it says that for any kind of recognition to occur, that you actually have to act on it, that you have to not just recognize it, but you have to pick up that piece of currency and go somewhere and spend it or deposit in a bank. Effectuation is much more about what you do with it when you have recognized it, rather than whether you recognize it or not. Because whether you recognize it is all about antecedent conditions and institutions and things like that. And effectuation just takes those for granted, however the world is at this point in time. So given who you are, you may or may not recognize it, but recognition involves more than just seeing the note. It involves picking that note up and doing something with it, and that's where effectuation comes in.
Okay, excellent. Good, great answer. Thank you for that. So now switching, I want you to put on your doctoral advisor cap here, because now
that's a cap I'm trying to take off. You need to get away from that cap.
I know I'm working on identity theory right now. It's like every identity, new identity. So this one is actually for career oriented, and this is, you can tell, coming from some doctorate students or young scholars in the field. And the first question that they emailed to us is, how receptive is the field of entrepreneurship to scholars from other disciplines such as OB wishing to make important contributions? How can entrepreneurship research be enriched from contributions from other areas?
Okay, again, I'm going to give a slightly probably abnormal take on this. If anything, entrepreneurship is overly welcoming of anybody and everybody, and we kind of humbly listen to everybody. I mean, people from every discipline come and tell entrepreneurship, you should really, entrepreneurship is just a setting for us, right? I'm a social psychologist, and this is just a setting. It's kind of an interesting setting. Or I'm an economist, or I'm an accountant, or whatever, and this is just an interesting setting, and we have always welcomed it. Dean Shepard and the current editorial board of Journal of Business Venturing, in conjunction with advice from Venkat, my colleague who used to be editor of Journal of Business Venturing, they explicitly embrace this, right? We create areas within the journal so people from other disciplines can publish. So in general, the entrepreneurship division, I think, is the most welcoming, fun division ever. The reason I said that we may be doing too much of it is I actually want us to do a little bit more. So if someone comes from OB and says, you guys don't know anything, and here's how you are supposed to do a field experiment or a field survey, and for us, I don't really care about entrepreneurship, but from the point of view of studying OB, this is kind of interesting. I like that, do good work, and if it has implications for entrepreneurship, I want to embrace you, I want to hug you, but I also want you to go back and talk to OB and tell them about entrepreneurship. I want you to read entrepreneurship. I want you to say, what are some theories and findings that are happening in entrepreneurship, and they have implications for OB, for example, right? So a lot of the stuff that comes out of effectuation has implications for goal-setting theory in OB, for example. And we don't do that. I myself have been guilty. I've never written a paper that is addressed to OB scholars on goal-setting. But I think as researchers in entrepreneurship, we have to do it. But also when people from other discipline come in, after I embrace them and give them a hug and help them to publish in JBV or any other top journal they choose to, I also would like to see the dialogue go back out into the disciplines. And that's my only request. But I think we really are kind of embracing. And if anybody has any complaints on that, I would say email me and I'll see what I can do to help.
That's a very generous offer, and I have no doubt you will be getting emails on that one. Yes. So in terms of jobs, and this is obviously from a doc student too, how receptive do you think the field is to hiring people with a micro focus Because, like for instance, myself here, I come from a strategy background. So how do you see the field in terms of actually hiring micro scholars?
Okay. That's a slightly tougher one, because the practical reality for a lot of entrepreneurship positions is that we don't really have entrepreneurship as an area. So almost by default in a lot of universities, this is just kind of lumped with strategy, right? Which means you have mostly scholars from with a more meso or macro perspective. Most of their research and interests are in that perspective, hiring people. And so when you actually have somebody with a micro coming into it, it becomes a little tougher to make the decision, but also to kind of shepherd you through the tenure process becomes a little bit more difficult. So there are practical difficulties here. But still, you know, I was at the University of Washington, and Tom Lee and Terence Mitchell, I mean, people of micro, they not only hired me, they really shepherded me through the process. If it was not for Terry Mitchell and Tom Lee's advice, I would never have been able to publish in the Academy of Management at all. So I think individual departments and scholars in the department make a lot of difference. So in general, yeah, getting your foot in the door may be a little bit more difficult if a strategy recruitment committee is actually hiring, maybe a little bit. But I know that there are many schools where the particular senior scholars in a particular department in a particular business school can make a huge difference. And I would say do not underestimate that. Do not just apply for a job like you would apply for a job. Look people up, talk to them, and I suspect that many more people are more receptive than you think, which comes to the same idea of learned optimism. You have to experiment with this. Don't go just by what people are saying. Individuals matter. Senior scholars in departments matter. So don't use the broad brushstroke of saying that because most jobs coming from the macro committee means that micro people cannot get a job. I would say don't do that. Do a little bit more research. Talk to people, and you will be surprised.
Excellent answer. Thank you. And so last question before I ask for your closing comments, try to make sure you make your flight. How to spot a genius strategy before it becomes popularized and spoken about at every conference? This is someone.
I was a little confused by that question.
Yeah.
What do you mean by genius strategy? I'm not quite sure what that means.
Well, I think it means you're a genius, first of all, but on top of that, in terms of the next, how do you pick the next hot thing?
So how do we know somebody's a genius, somebody's going to be a genius researcher? Is that the idea? Well, I don't think, I think most human beings are very bad at that, right? I mean, who's the person who gets it right? Warren Buffett, like one guy in all of finance, you know? And what he does is he just works with things he knows, right? He won't touch tech, and he is just investing in things he eats and actually uses. So I am not very sure how you can spot genius, but I can tell you that if you want to come upon an idea that actually makes a difference and lives and endures, it really takes working at it, right? It's really saying, so here's how I tell my doctoral students is. So for those of us who are familiar with math problems, right, we have this standard idea of an objective function with constraints. So things like job, publications, tenure, these are all constraints. And if you let the constraints determine your objective function, chances are very high you're not going to come upon any idea that is worth pursuing that will endure. So you have to be, at the same time, if you completely disregard the constraints, you're going to be gone. You may be a genius, but you're not going to be around for anybody to, you're not going to be around to write, let alone have anybody read your stuff. So that's the problem. So the idea is to heed constraints, but be very conscious that these are constraints, and these constraints should not determine your objective function. So I would say pick a problem that is deep, that is difficult, that will endure, that probably you will never find an answer to in your life. And then you have to make it into bite-sized pieces that can actually be published or that can result in a decent presentation or a conference and stuff like that. So heeding the constraints is extremely important, but not allowing them to determine your objective function and to choose objective functions that you care for as a human being, I think is extremely important. I'll just give you one example. Right now, for example, we have a whole series of false assumptions about what our field is about, right? So we assume, for example, Silicon Valley is important, venture capital is important, and entrepreneurship is something should be explained in terms of people whose first option or default option is jobs. So this transition from job to entrepreneurship is an important phenomenon. But if you actually think about the phenomenon, none of those things. I mean, Silicon Valley and venture capital are so rare and so little that no self-respecting statistician who looks at the landscape of entrepreneurship would even consider them phenomenon, right? I mean, they are so small that they should not be part of entrepreneurship at all. They're that small in terms of statistics. And yet, when you think about the amount of effort that goes into understanding it, it's crazy. And for a large percentage of human beings, I think like 4 billion people or whatever, jobs are not an option, right? So the idea that jobs are the default and then we have to explain entrepreneurship, we should revert it on its head. And even in the case of developed countries, educated people in urban areas who leave a job to start a company, most of them actually don't leave a job to start a company. We know the research on hybrid entrepreneurship is something in the correct direction, that a lot of people don't really leave their jobs to start a company. There are many, so we have to rethink the whole idea of how jobs work with entrepreneurship. So take up some problem like that. What's the connection between labor market and entrepreneurship? And what do we know? Go study labor market economics, labor sociology, and then come and think. So stuff like that. I would say take something difficult, something huge, something important. Now say, how do I actually do some survey or some experiment or something that'll actually get published in JBV or AMJ or whatever I need to publish in, and that's fine. But if you start with I have to publish in AMJ, and then you determine what you want to research, that would be so I don't know what a good strategy is to be a journalist, but I know bad strategies when I see one.
No, I love your comment actually, because that gets you back to intellectual curiosity and why we do what we do anyway.
Yeah.
The ability to go out and think and to look for new, innovative, novel ideas and solutions.
Yeah.
So great job. Do you have any closing comments for us before we let you go?
Nothing in particular. This was way more fun than I thought it would be actually. So I enjoyed it. Thank you for this opportunity, and I just want to thank everybody who sent questions, and feel free to email me as well. And Clay, thank you very much for thinking of me for this, and to Kathleen as well. Excellent.
And so wrapping things up, Saras, thank you again for being our inaugural speaker for the Speak with the Scholar. Thank you very much for this. And this is an initiative out of the Entrepreneurship Division. And I want to highlight and thank a few people real quickly. Kathleen Randerson, who's in charge of the Communications Division, and Norris Kruger, who's also very helpful. And I'd like to thank Jason Lordy, our webmaster, who was the one kind enough to create this video feed for us and archiving it. And I also like to thank my doctorate student, David Marshall, who is working he's working on hybrid entrepreneurship, so he's really pleased with your last comments. So he's really fired up about that. But thank you all for your help there. And we will send out a note when this has been archived and uploaded and can be used by anybody in the future. But once again, thank you very much for doing this, Saras, and nothing but the best. And once again, one last plug for you, www.effectuation.org. Make sure you go check that out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Clay. Bye-bye.
Bye.